The sky over Germany was supposed to be cold and clear, the kind of winter morning bomber crews learned to accept as part of the job. Instead, for First Lieutenant William Robert Lawley Jr., it became a narrow corridor between life and death. His B-17 Flying Fortress had just come off the target near Leipzig on the 20th of February 1944, when enemy fighters tore into the formation. Cannon shells smashed into his aircraft, glass exploded around him, and the giant bomber rolled sickeningly into a dive. In the right-hand seat, his copilot slumped lifeless over the controls, and in the chaos of that moment, it looked as if the entire crew would follow him. Lawley, only 23 years old, suddenly had one bad arm, a bleeding face, a dead man pinning the yoke forward, and 10 souls depending on what he did next. Before we continue, I want to mention the Medal of Honor book series that accompanies this work. These books tell the stories of America's Medal of Honor recipients in a serious, readable, and historically grounded format, with each volume focused on a specific campaign, battle, or part of the war. They are available in color paperback, Kindle ebook, and matching audiobook editions. You can find them at militaryauthor.me. Welcome to Beyond the Call, Medal of Honor Stories, the Monday feature of Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, and a companion podcast developed by trackpads.com. Today we follow the young pilot from Leeds, Alabama, as he fights to keep a burning, crippled B-17 in the air long enough to save his crew, and we see how one decision to stay with the wounded no matter the cost turned a routine mission into an enduring story of courage and responsibility. Before that February morning, Lawley's path had been unremarkable in the way many paths to greatness are. He grew up in a mill town on the edge of Birmingham, came of age during the Great Depression, and graduated from high school in 1938. Like many young Americans of his generation, he was drawn toward aviation when war clouds gathered overseas. In April 1942, he enlisted and began the demanding journey from cadet to pilot, learning not only how to fly, but how to shoulder the lives of others every time he climbed into a cockpit. At a training base in Oklahoma, he earned his wings and his commission, proving himself steady, reliable, and quick to learn. Those qualities mattered more than swagger. The Army Air Forces needed quiet professionals who would bring bombers and crews home night after night. By early 1944, Lawley was a first lieutenant in the 364th Bombardment Squadron, 305th Bombardment Group, flying B-17s from chilly English airfields as part of the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign. The plan that day was straightforward on paper: bomb critical targets around Leipzig, help grind down German industry, and draw enemy fighters into battles they could not afford to lose. In the briefing rooms, the route lines were clear, and the expected flak belts were marked in grease pencil. Crews checked their gear, went through rituals that blended training and superstition, and climbed aboard their aircraft. For Lawley and his crew, their B-17 was both workplace and lifeboat, a metal world where 10 men depended on each other's competence and calm. Things went wrong after bombs away. As the formation turned away from the target, waves of German fighters slammed into the bomber stream. In minutes, the clear sky filled with tracer fire, black puffs of flak, and twisting contrails. For Lawley's fortress, it was like being shoved into the center of a storm. Cannon shells raked the fuselage, tore through oxygen lines, and smashed into the cockpit. One exploded with deadly effect on the right side, killing the co-pilot instantly. Shrapnel shredded the windshield, hurled glass and metal into Lawley's face, and left him bleeding, half-blinded, and barely able to use his right arm. The damage knocked the bomber into a steep dive. The airspeed needle raced upward, and the ground rushed closer. What happened next began with a simple, brutal act of will. Lawley realized that the dead co-pilot's weight was forcing the control yoke forward, holding the aircraft in its dive. With his one good hand and what strength he had left, he shoved his friend's body off the controls. Then he hauled back on the yoke and fought the big aircraft level again. The B-17 groaned under the strain, its damaged wings and fuselage protesting every movement, but the dive stopped. The horizon steadied. In those few seconds, he had dragged the bomber, and everyone in it, back from the edge of destruction. Only then could he start to understand the full scope of their situation. The damage report was bleak. One engine burned fiercely on the wing, threatening to spread fire along the structure and tear the aircraft apart. Another sputtered and smoked. Control cables and flight surfaces were damaged, making the bomber sluggish and unpredictable. The crew discovered that the bombs were still aboard. The cold and damage had jammed the release mechanisms. The aircraft was heavy with explosives, fuel, and 10 battered men, 8 of whom had suffered wounds of varying severity. In this condition, standard procedure was clear: jettison what you could, get the crew out over any survivable terrain, and accept that the airplane was lost. The air over Nazi-held Europe was littered with the wreckage of bombers whose crews had made that choice. As Lawley wrestled with the controls and fire licked at the wing, word came up from the rear of the aircraft that changed the equation. 2 of the men were so badly wounded that they could not possibly bail out. They could not stand, could not move to the hatch, and could not count on their parachutes saving them even if they were pushed clear. If the rest of the crew abandoned ship, those men would be left to die in the wreckage. In the freezing, blood-slicked cockpit, with enemy fighters still prowling outside, Lawley absorbed that information. He knew what it meant. He also knew that the safest choice, personally, would be to give the bailout order and leave while there was still time. Instead, he made a different choice. Lawley announced that he would stay with the aircraft and try to get it home. Any man physically able to jump was free to do so. In the event, the crew stayed. That shared commitment mattered. It meant that while he fought the burning engine with rudder, power settings, and careful banking, using the airflow itself to smother the flames, other crewmen could treat the wounded, move ammunition, and keep an eye out for more fighters. It meant the bomber remained a team effort rather than a collection of isolated men waiting to fall. Outside, enemy aircraft swung in for another pass, forcing Lawley to throw the B-17 into evasive maneuvers with barely functioning controls. Inside, wounded men gritted their teeth as every jolt sent new waves of pain through their bodies. Against the odds, the immediate attacks fell away. The burning engine came under control, at least for the moment. Lawley pointed the battered nose west, toward the distant promise of the English coast. What followed was less a flight than a prolonged struggle. To escape the worst of the cold and reduce the risk of oxygen problems, he had to bring the aircraft down from its high-altitude world. But descending increased the danger from ground-based defenses and reduced the gliding options if another engine failed. His instruments were smeared with blood, and the forward view was fragmented by shattered glass, forcing him to rely on side windows, on instinct, and on years of training to keep the B-17 flying straight and true. Through it all, he refused first aid. Every second away from the controls felt like a second the aircraft might not have. One engine had already been shut down, and its propeller feathered to reduce drag. Another coughed and flared with new fire, demanding more delicate handling from a man whose body was close to its limits. Each adjustment of power and rudder sent new pain through his torn face and injured arm. Behind him, crewmen worked over the wounded with the limited supplies they had, improvising bandages and trying to keep injured men conscious. The fortress had been built to absorb punishment, but now it stayed aloft as much through the pilot's will as through its own rugged design. Time stretched. Germany slid by beneath them, then the cold waters of the Channel, and finally, at last, the hazy outline of England came into view. Lawley's strength finally ran out. He collapsed in his seat, overcome by blood loss, shock, and exhaustion. For a moment it seemed that the aircraft that had survived fighters, flak, and fire would be lost because its pilot simply had nothing left to give. The bombardier pulled him back from the yoke, did what he could to stop the bleeding, and kept the bomber steady. Even half destroyed, the B-17 still needed a guiding hand. But the story did not end there. As the aircraft neared friendly ground and an emergency field was identified below, Lawley regained consciousness. He woke to find himself still in the cockpit of a machine that should have been in pieces, with wounded men still depending on him to finish what he had started. Weak, barely able to see clearly through swollen eyes and blood-streaked glass, he took the controls again. The field below was a fighter strip, not a heavy bomber base. Shorter runway, less room for error. No chance of circling around for another try if things went wrong. To make matters worse, another engine failed as they set up the approach, leaving him with uneven power and a very narrow margin for control. In those final minutes, all the complexity of the mission boiled down to a simple requirement: get the airplane on the ground in one piece. Lawley brought the B-17 in as gently as its condition allowed, accepting that it might settle hard, skid, and tear at the seams. The crew braced at their stations, many clustered around the most badly wounded to shield them from impact. The landing was rough. Metal screamed, tires and landing gear took loads they were never meant to endure, and parts of the airframe gave way. But the bomber did what it had done all day. It held together just enough. When the wreckage finally slid to a halt, the men inside were still alive. Fire crews and medics rushed forward to pull the wounded clear. The men who had been too injured to bail out over Germany lay on friendly soil, with a chance to see home again. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the bomb group and beyond. In mess halls, hospital wards, and briefing rooms, airmen heard the story of the young pilot who had stayed in his seat, refused first aid, and fought a dying aircraft across hundreds of miles because he would not abandon his wounded. In a war filled with valor, this particular combination of skill, endurance, and loyalty stood out. It captured something essential about what it meant to be responsible not just for a mission, but for the lives of the men who flew it with you. In time, the formal acknowledgement matched the informal respect. William Robert Lawley Jr. received the Medal of Honor for what he had done that day. The citation described his extraordinary courage and skill in regaining control of his crippled bomber, his persistence in the face of severe wounds, and his refusal to leave behind two unconscious, gravely injured crewmen. It reduced a long, harrowing flight to a handful of official sentences, as citations must, but behind those words lay vivid images. The dead co-pilot pushed off the controls, the smoke-filled cockpit, the conscious choice to stay, the long, limping journey home, and the final, desperate landing on an inadequate strip. After the war, Lawley stayed in uniform as the Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force, and aviation moved into a new age of jets and long-range bombers. He carried the memory of that mission with him through a long career and into civilian life. For his surviving crewmen and their families, the meaning was simpler. Every ordinary day they enjoyed after the 20th of February 1944 existed because their pilot had chosen not to save himself at their expense. Quiet family gatherings, children and grandchildren, peaceful moments that never make it into history books. All of these formed part of the real legacy of his decision over Leipzig. Today, when we look back at those wartime photographs of young men standing in front of their bombers, it can be tempting to see them as symbols rather than individuals. William Robert Lawley Jr.'s story reminds us that inside each of those aircraft was someone like him, a person raised in a small town, trained in a hurry, thrown into a vast conflict, and then confronted with choices that would define not only their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. His determination to keep flying a burning, broken B-17 until he had given his wounded crew every possible chance is the kind of quiet, stubborn courage that the Medal of Honor exists to recognize. It is also exactly the kind of story Beyond the Call is meant to keep alive, so that the next generation can understand not only what these men did, but why it mattered so deeply to the people whose lives they saved.